This week on the marquee, we have Jack the Joker Hermansson returning from some time off to get a very big win to kind of stake his claim as a continued contender in this division as he turns back Joe Pyfer, who, you all saw it. He had the hype behind him. He had the UFC machine, if you will, a little bit looking at him like he could be a next guy here. And I think a lot of people, I mean, us included in a way, considering all three of us picked Joe Pyfer last week, I think a lot of people were ready to kind of have Joe Pyfer win this fight and move into the rankings and take the next step in his career. And none of that happened. Jack was not about it. So to break down the fight, Joe Pyfer did come out and look exactly how we all thought he would. You know, the size, the athleticism, the speed, the power, all of it was on display through those first two rounds. He was landing on Jack and he was landing hard. More than once, I was surprised that Jack hadn't been wobbled more than he was. It seemed like he was taking the shots surprisingly well. But once it got past round two, it was a much different fight. And you could tell that that's what Jack was going for by the way he fought the first 7 or 8 minutes of that fight. There were very few risks coming from him. He was really just trying to get himself through those rounds. You know, it's a risk for sure to start that way, but he must have been very confident that if he could get through that first round and a half, 2 rounds, that the fight was going to swing heavily his way. And I was a little worried about Pyfer's gas tank. You know, he hasn't been to a round 3 since I think it's 2018. Big power puncher, that frame, obviously. I just figured he'd be okay enough to win one more at some point after being up 2-0. But I was wrong. He couldn't do it. You know, midway through round 2, I would say Jack started picking up the pace a bit. He started moving forward more. He started landing his leg kicks. And by the end of that round, I think Pyfer was already feeling that leg a little bit. Jack had gotten his timing down by then. And really from that point on, Joe just couldn't find a way to change things up once Jack kind of got that timing down and decided he would start moving forward a bit. Round 3, Joe was just getting jabbed cleanly over and over. He got hurt to the eye midway through the round. He couldn't see for a bit, and Jack really poured it on for like a 30-second stretch there. And then by round 4, Joe's burst was really just gone. Like he would push. He would get like a minute where he kind of looked like he had earlier in the fight. But for the most part, that burst, that energy, it wasn't there. And his leg was hurt. You could clearly see that. He started looking for takedowns, but they weren't there at all. Credit to Jack, because I think a lot of people, and even rightfully so, had really started to believe in the takedown ability and the grappling of Joe Pyfer. And it wasn't even a factor in this fight because Jack just was not allowing it. He was stuffing everything. And once that was the case, it really just became Jack's fight to dictate on the feet. And then in round 5, obviously, he's the one that took it down and capped everything off with his wrestling. So it was just a fantastic veteran performance from Jack. He did exactly what he had to do in order to counter the natural gifts of Joe Pyfer. And he fought a perfect fight. So props to him. That was a hell of a way for him to come back and jump right back into the mix in this division. And Joe, you know, him losing this fight, this is what I hate that fans do sometimes. Like, people bet on Joe Pyfer and then he loses and it's like, oh, Joe Pyfer sucks. Joe Pyfer was never good. Like, the skills that everyone was so excited about in Joe Pyfer are still there. They didn't go anywhere. You saw him through 10 minutes of this fight. It's just that he had his first 5-round fight against a true veteran who had a great game plan, who was able to take what Joe Pyfer brought and put a pace on him and find a way to, you know, to, like I said, to counter the skills that he has. So just because that happened does not mean that Joe is not going to be something in this division. Not like I think the guy's going to be the champion, but he's still got plenty of room to grow. And as I keep saying, he's got a lot of natural gifts. So I'm sure he will take this back, learn from this, and we'll see a better Joe Pyfer going forward. And you've got to think the cardio becomes a real focus for him. So I'm interested to see his next fight for sure, which I guess segues me into our usual deal here, which is that after these recaps, we will offer up some matchups that we would like to see for each fighter going forward. So I'll start with Joe since I was just kind of ending by talking about him. I'm going to pair him with another guy who just lost on this card, which is Brad Tavares. I think that there's no reason for Joe to take too big of a step back, and I think that Brad is that perfect, kind of similar but slightly lower level veteran test in there. And obviously this wouldn't be in a 3-rounder, so the cardio is going to be less of a factor. But Brad can do a lot of things. Brad's also impossible to take down. And he is a skilled striker who's been in there across from a ton of guys and hung tough. So I think that is a perfect next test for Joe and would mean something if he could get past Brad Tavares. So that's where I'd go with Joe. And for Hermansson, I am going to say the winner of a fight that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this episode, which is a fight that is on this weekend's card. And that is Anthony Hernandez and Roman Kopylov. I think the winner of that fight is going to have themselves in line for a pretty big fight. I think Jack, as much as he got a good win here, he hasn't necessarily earned something again with like one of these, upper echelon at middleweight, of which there is quite a few right now. And I think Jack is kind of a rung below that. So I think he's got to get one more for that type of fight. And I think the winner of Hernandez and Kopylov would be exactly that, especially if it's Hernandez. Jack and Hernandez would be a really interesting fight. So that is where I'll go. All right, let's move into the co-main. So like I was saying to you guys in the beginning of this, I'm going to go through the 6 main card fights, but I'm gonna focus on the 4 that I feel like were a bigger deal, and I'll match those up, and then I'll save the other 2 and just kind of do those quickly at the end, almost lightning round style like we usually do. I don't know what's up with my camera tonight. I feel like it's usually a bit higher, but oh well, that's life when you're doing a one-man show. All right, so co-main, big result, of course. Dan Ige, round 1 knockout of Andre Fili. It does feel like we were robbed of a potentially memorable scrap here. It was shaping up nicely. But Danny didn't care. He got the job done, and he did it in absolute style. Fili was almost daring him to step in. He was waiting to step back and counter, and it was working well enough for a bit. But Ige closed the distance too quick on the last one, and Fili's chin was still right there in range for that right hand. And he ate it. And that is a pretty big statement for Dan Ige, man. He's a guy who continually gets brought up as a potential stepping stone. Excuse me while I stop dying. Thank you. Continually gets brought up as a potential stepping stone, or at least I'll say a gatekeeper of the rankings at 145. The UFC does it, and we do it too. A guy's working his way up, looking good, and we're saying, let's see if he can get past the Dan Ige. He's just, that's kind of where he is. He's almost becoming Neil Magny-ish at featherweight. And this one, late notice for Fili or not, was really a statement from Dan Ige of his continued status as a ranked level fighter in this division, and not a guy that seems to be going away anytime soon. To put Fili down like that and make it 3 wins in his last 4, that's pretty nice work from Dan Ige. So you got to give him credit. To segue into the matchups for this one, if you listen to this show regularly, you probably know what I'm going to say, because I bring this up for Dan Ige anytime that it seems to make sense. And this is another time that it does make sense, which is a rematch with Edson Barbosa. I have always wanted them to have a rematch. I thought the first fight was extremely close. I didn't love that it went Ige's way. It's still, to date, his best win at 145. A lot of his ranking, I think, kind of comes from that. And I would like to see it run back, either to have Dan Ige prove it and further prove his legitimacy as a contender at 145, or for Edson to get that W back. And I think it's still has the potential to be a great scrap. So I go there. If it doesn't work, I'll give you another idea, which is Diego Lopes. If he can get past Sadiq Youssef, I think that's a great fight as well. And then on the other side of this, for Andre Fili, I don't want to penalize him here. He had looked really solid in his last fight. He took this fight on late notice, saved the co-main event. So I'm going to give him a fight against a at least somewhat similar level. And a guy who's never fought before, which I think is actually a really interesting fight, and that is Alex Caceres. I think the two of them, Caceres also coming off a loss, I think the two of them could be a very interesting matchup. So that's where I will go for Andre, the man who likes big booty Latinas. if you saw that press conference after his last fight. All right, so we'll do two more, full breakdown style. The next one that I'm going to do here is Gregory Rodrigues, the man that we affectionately refer to on this show as Hobocop. He got himself a round 3 TKO of Brad Tavares. This was a great scrap for as long as it lasted. Gregory Rodrigues came out like a man on a mission. He was walking Brad down, throwing absolute heat, and Brad was with it, man. He was in there to scrap, but he just doesn't carry the same type of artillery that Gregory Rodrigues does. He was finding ways to give Rodrigues problems for sure. His hands were faster. He was mixing in the leg kicks. He was countering pretty well. But Rodrigues is just a large, powerful, dangerous middleweight who is continually coming at you. And God, the barrage that he put on Tavares at the end was just nasty. It looked like he was hitting Tavares with bats, and Tavares didn't even go down. But man, he was rocked for sure. It was absolutely a good stoppage, and even got a takedown on Brad at one point, which no one does. So check that box for him too. But yeah, it was just the physicality and pressure and power, the difference in power in the shots was too much for Brad. As much as he was hanging shot for a little bit, it was just too much. And Rodrigues, overcame him as the fight went on and got a huge win. That's 4 finishes now in his last 5 fights. So he is due for a pretty significant opponent, I would say here, next time out. That's a big win. So I'll parlay that right into the matchups. For Tavares, obviously, I already answered for you guys earlier when I was talking about the main event. My answer is Joe Pyfer, which, I guess maybe that feels like a little bit of a reward for Tavares just because Pyfer was in a main event, which was higher on the card than Brad. But really, rankings-wise, they're not in dissimilar spots at all. And Brad has obviously proven more in his career than Pyfer has. So I think it's the right move. They're both coming off a loss. Brad obviously just had that nice win against Weidman, whatever you think that's worth at this point in Chris's career. But Brad did look good. So Brad gets a chance to, turn back an up-and-comer and get himself right back to winning ways. And Pyfer gets a chance to get past a proven veteran. So I like that matchup. And then for Hobocop, as I said, I am giving him the step up. I'm going to go with Roman Dolidze. We were on here last week talking about Roman, saying how he did not look good. And I was saying personally how I didn't expect, even though he's obviously a ranked fighter, how I didn't expect the UFC to give him a ranked fighter next time out. And I was trying to think of guys outside the rankings who could make some sense. I think I threw Aliskerov out there, somebody else. But I like this one. I do. As good as Rodrigues has looked, the fact that he has showed us how dangerous he can be as a striker and as a grappler, we still haven't even fully tapped into the grappling expertise that this man has. Dolidze may be the guy to bring that out of him. I just think that that's a great fight, and I think that Gregory Rodrigues deserves that chance. So, yeah, I'm going Robocop and Dolidze. Okay. Moving to the last of the 4 bigger deal fights, I think, from this card that I'm going to fully recap. We had Rodolfo Vieira get himself a big win with a first-round submission over Armen Petrosyan. And I say a big win not just because not meaning that Petrosyan is some huge name, because he's not. I mean, he was 3-1 in the UFC. He's been solid, but a big win in that Vieira had some hype on him, years back. Obviously, he took that loss to Fluffy where he looked really bad, and he kind of hasn't been able to really reignite that hype. And I think he may have gotten that going now with a finish like that, first round. I think he moves himself up the line here, and he's going to probably have an interesting opponent in his next one where he could really, break through to a level that people thought he was going to reach prior. As for the fight, Petrosyan didn't look good, man. He's shown in the past that he can put up more resistance than that to the takedowns and to the grappling. But this one was all Vieira. The first takedown he went for, he got. And then as soon as Petrosyan turned and gave his back, I was like, all right, we're in trouble. And we were, Vieira had a hold of him. He ended up picking him up, slamming him, moved to the mount like clockwork. And thankfully for him, he was able to, I mean, I'm sure he was aware of the clock. He's that good that you would think he probably was, but he was able to slowly transition and set up that arm triangle with enough time left in the round to force the tap. And he got it. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, that's a really big performance from him. His 5th sub in the UFC, 2 wins in a row. And we'll see now if he can put that run together. As I said, that fluffy loss some years back was a roadblock, but it seems the momentum is back now. So we will see. And Petrosyan, yeah, as I said, we've seen better from him. That was not the performance he was looking for at all. You wonder if he could have survived that first round, if things could have started to turn his way, because you knew the first round was going to be tough. Absolutely. It always is with Vieira. But he could not. So tough one for him. He goes back to the drawing board. I'll stick with him first. I will use him as a test for Shara Bullet. We've only seen one fight in the UFC from Shara Bullet so far. Obviously, he looked very good. I think Petrosyan is right at that level where he is a proven guy, proven skills. He has a win over a guy like Gregory Rodrigues, who I was just talking about, deserving a ranked fighter. And I think he's a really good test for Shara Bullet, and he's not going to look to take Shara down, which is huge at this point, because obviously the one potential glaring weakness in Shara's game is his takedown defense and wrestling. So this gives him one more fight to continue to work on that, where he gets to be in there against a fellow striker, a guy who's almost certainly not going to look for the takedown in Petrosyan, and still get an interesting test across from him. So that's where I'm going to go for Armen. And for Vieira, as I said, I am moving him up the line, not quite to the rankings, but a guy who's been there before. I'm going to book some Brazil on Brazil violence, and I am going to put him across from Andre Muniz, simply because I would love to see the grappling that ensues and see who can get the better of who. I just think that's a fantastic fight. I'm not sure if they're friendly. They certainly don't train at the same camp or anything. So hopefully that is a fight both guys would be down for, because I think that'd be fucking awesome. So that is where I will go there. All right. So before we move into the big card, which I'm sure is what everyone more so wants to hear about, I'll just close out the main card from this past weekend with 2 quick recaps. The first of which is Ihor Potieria moving down to middleweight with a UD victory over Robert. I actually forget how they were saying it now. Bryczek. Apologies if that is wrong. But he was the debutant in this fight. Potieria was a late notice replacement who stepped in, and Rob came out, throwing some hammers, especially early. You could see why he has the knockouts on his record that he does. But Potieria generally handled him throughout. He used his length, he used his speed, he had a higher work rate, and he kind of just, all that allowed him to stay ahead pretty much that whole fight. And then he hurt him in round 3 and had him in some trouble a couple times. It looked like he might actually get him out of there. But it was a good win. So he's 1-0 as UFC middleweight now. We'll see how this weight class works for him. Excuse me. It's hard doing a one-man show. I don't know how these other guys who have one-man podcasts do it. You never get a break. Your voice is just going. So yeah, what was I saying? So yeah, he's 1-0 as a UFC middleweight. We'll see what kind of run he can put together at the weight class. He did have a bit of a rough stretch up at 205. Obviously, he had the one Shogun win, which is all he really, can claim as good performances from him in the UFC to this point. But it did seem like the weight cut went fine, even on short notice. So I don't know if this was already in the plans for him. And it seemed like being the bigger middleweight did give him some advantages, that he did use that length and maybe additional power. And we'll see what he can make out of this move to 185. And then the one other that I got to touch on, my boy, Michael Johnson. I was very happy to see him get a W. He got the UD victory over Darrius Flowers, and he looked good. It was nice to see him just cleanly win a fight without any tense moments. No, like, oh my God, he's, putting himself in a submission or oh man, he got fucking turned off with a hook or whatever. It was just a fight that he pretty much was in control of the whole time. Flowers didn't look like he had a lot to offer from jump. He fights very calmly, which I guess is a credit to him, but he just wasn't bringing enough toward Johnson to get him thinking too much about, I think, what was coming back at him from Flowers. So he was kind of able to just really mix it up and fight his fight. I loved all the body shots that we saw from him. I always love Michael Johnson's body shots. He's one of the best going to the body. It was nice to see him show off the wrestling and the grappling a bit, which we don't generally see from him. Just a good, well-rounded win from Michael Johnson. So was definitely happy about that.